So you may recall that last week, when I talked about deception, at the end of class, I apologized to everybody for how grumpy I had been all class. That's going to happen again today, because this is not a happy subject. This is an analysis of international society, and we said at the beginning of this class, some elements of nonverbal communication are biological or have a strong biological root. And so a lot of this research applies broadly. But other roots are very culture specific. And I was brought here by Fulbright to give you some intercultural experiences and to explain what research says about communication in the West generally, in the United States in particular. And when we talk about race, that is so culturally specific that today's lessons effectively are, what do we know from nonverbal communication research about how people in the United States of different races relate to one another? And primarily, most of the research being done is interaction between white people and black people. And we'll talk about that quite a bit today. But there are two things I'm going to do before we get into the nonverbal communication research. I'm first going to distinguish the concept of race from the concept of ethnicity. Race and ethnicity. They are very commonly confused, but they're also pretty easy to explain, I think. Race, which we will start with, has three elements, three puzzle pieces. The first of them is, you are the race you are based on your appearance. Of the three elements, the first is appearance. People will jump to conclusions about what race you are by what you look like. Now, if I'm going to talk about this, I need to name what races are we discussing. There's no perfect answer to that I'll explain why in a moment. But what I'm going to use, the United States government, the bureau that collects the census every 10 years, counts how many people are in the country, how many do various jobs, also collects information on what race people are. They use 5 categories: Native American or Native Alaskan, Black, Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, white, and Asian. There's a 6th one that is other. But that's it. And you might be thinking, now wait a minute. 1 category for Asian. So you're saying Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Thai, and I could keep going. And you could probably, some of you would say, I could tell them apart at a glance. And I agree with you, but I could also tell, very often, not always, I could tell someone's from Ireland, or from Germany, or from Sweden, or from Italy, but racially they're all white. The fact that you can tell where they're from, the category of race is not that specific. It's based on some superficial characteristics of appearance. And it's important to keep in mind, race is a human invention. We decided to categorize people this way. There is nothing in the natural world that makes it necessary for people to be categorized that way. Here's a way to think about it. When small children draw a rainbow, they almost always draw stripes. But if you look at the visible light spectrum, there are no stripes. It's one smooth gradient from side to side. The same is true of human appearance. The distinctions between them are arbitrary. One of the chief distinctions between people of Asian race and other races is the epicanthic fold in the eyelid. But there's a people group in Africa, the Kung Sa people. They have epicanthic folds. There are medical conditions all around the rest of the world that give people epicanthic folds. Making that a way to separate people into categories is actually pretty irrational. You might have a look at these 4 women, all of whom identify as black women. They're light-skinned, but they're black. And light-skinned versus dark-skinned is its own issue. But then you can compare them to this young lady. She's from Greece. Racially, she's white. So race is something human beings invented, and it's not very rational. Racism, on the other hand, is real. It's a persistent set of behaviors and a set of ways that we have organized our civilization. And I'm not going to talk at length about racism, because this is a class in communication, and I'm going to get to the nonverbal research as quickly as I can. But you might think of it this way. There are a lot of mentally ill people in the world who one of their delusional symptoms is someone is controlling their brain with microwaves. That's not 1 or 2 people. There are thousands of people who report that symptom. Now, microwaves that can control your brain do not exist. That's never been invented. But the mental illness of thinking they do exist, that does exist. Very well documented. Lots of people have it. Race, it's imaginary. It's a set of categories that does not correspond to nature. Racism, that surely does exist. Okay, the first element of race is appearance. The second element is your family history. You are the race you are, in part, based on what race your ancestors were. In the United States, this often is a reference to the fact that from the founding of the country until 1865, at the end of the American Civil War, by law, people who were black were not human beings and had no legal rights. Then in 1865, the American Constitution was amended to change that. But through that period, if you had a parent, or really any ancestor who was black, you were categorized as black and therefore had no legal rights. So your family history is relevant. Another aspect of this, in the United States, there are relations, troubled sometimes, between the United States government and Native American nations, Cherokee, Sioux, etc. They also determine if you're a member of that Native American nation by your family history. You have to have a parent, a grandparent, an ancestor who belonged to the nation if you want to, and have voting rights, be eligible for scholarships, that kind of thing. So, appearance, family history. The third element, self-identification. Self-identification. The United States only relatively recently had its first president who was not a white man. He could identify as biracial. President Obama could. These are his parents. His father was from Kenya. His mother was from Kansas in the United States. If Kansas does not ring a bell, if you know the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy was from Kansas. So, Barack Obama is biracial, but he does not identify as biracial because before he went into politics, back when nobody knew who he was, he said, nobody looked at him and said, oh, look at the biracial man. They looked at him and said, oh, look at the black man. And taxi drivers would not stop for him, and in other ways he was treated like a black man. So, one part of the puzzle of what race are you, some people have multiple statuses they could claim, and they make a choice, and they claim the one that has more to do with how they are treated day by day. So, appearance, family history, self-identification, that's race. Let us get then to ethnicity. An ethnicity is a group defined by shared physical elements of culture. Shared physical elements of culture. Now, what do I mean by physical elements of culture? Food, clothing, music, architectural styles. If you have a shared traditional homeland, if there's a shared language, and if there is a presumption that you will marry someone in the same group, the more of those that are true, the more likely that a group is an ethnicity. Now, these have been my visuals to introduce the concept of ethnicity to my American students for about 15 years. I ask them, who eats that? And who dresses like that? And there are also dance styles and musical styles associated with it. And where do they live? And what do they speak? Japanese is an ethnicity, not a race. Ireland, Irish language, Irish music, Irish food. Irish parents often encourage their children to marry another Irish person because the group is becoming assimilated and the traditions are being lost. That's very common with ethnic groups. One I didn't think about until recently, Arabic. I thought of Arabic, I thought of Saudi Arabia, thought it was just a country. Here are the countries that are members of the Arab League, where one of the primary languages is Arabic. They span a lot of different racial groups. Everybody in this picture identifies ethnically as Arabic. They trace their ancestry to one of the 12 Arab tribes. They have a shared language. They have a lot of shared physical manifestations of culture. It's an ethnicity. Finally, Judaism. That one surprises my American students sometimes the most. They say, wait, isn't being Jewish a religion? It's both a religion and an ethnicity. There is traditional food. There is music. There is clothing. There's a traditional homeland, Israel. There's a traditional language, Hebrew. There's a very strong norm. You are expected to marry another Jewish person. And I have known, I got an email 2 days ago from a dear friend that this is an accurate statement. She would say, I'm Jewish, but I'm an atheist. So she's Jewish, but does not believe that there is a God. And how can you be both? Isn't Judaism a religion? No, for her, it's an ethnicity. She goes home, her family celebrates Hanukkah, she knows all the right responses, she doesn't believe there is a God. So that's how to think about what an ethnicity is, and then I have an example to show you the relationship between the two. I want you to take a look at these young ladies. And I want you to think for a moment what race they look like from among the 5 that we mentioned at the beginning. They don't look white. They don't look Asian. Racially, they are black. But if you were to hear their music involves a lot of accordions. It involves, you would recognize the beat if you heard it. The food that they eat is mostly rice and beans. The young ladies I showed you, they live on an island near Florida called the Dominican Republic. Racially, they're black. Ethnically, they are Central and South American. They speak Spanish. So, race, ethnicity, 2 different things. Race is primarily your appearance and your history, and your interpretation of the history. Ethnicity, the daily physical features of culture that you use identify what ethnicity you belong to. The other thing that I need to try to make clear, because it comes up in several of the studies we'll talk about today, is this: implicit bias. Very commonly misunderstood. Major element in studies of how race operates. Now, the word implicit, all the word implicit means, it refers to things that happen in your brain that are unconscious and automatic. Unconscious and automatic. And by things, I mean attitudes, filters, perceptual filters. I have had students occasionally get confused and say, well, I really hate mushrooms on my pizza, so I have an implicit bias against mushrooms on pizza. No. If you know you don't like them, it's not an implicit bias. If you always thought mushrooms didn't bother you, and then one day you tasted a mushroom and you gagged, then maybe you had an implicit bias. You had an attitude you were not aware of until you were exposed to it. Implicit bias was the discovery of a couple of researchers, Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. Banaji was at Yale at the time. She's at Harvard now. Anthony Greenwald is still at the University of Washington. And one of the ways I've found that's a good way for you to understand what it is for us to simulate the implicit association test, because that is what researchers use to measure implicit bias. So, you can go back to taking notes in a minute, but what I'd like for you to do is just rest your hands very gently on the desk in front of you. And I'm going to show some names on the screen. You don't have to do it loudly, but just tap. Tap with your left hand if the name is Japanese. Tap with your right hand if the name is American. You ready? Okay. Okay. Very good. That would be round one of the implicit association test. Round two, I would show you this. And I would say phrases are about to come up. Tap with your left hand if what's described, if most people would find it pleasant. Maybe not you specifically, but most people. And your right hand if what comes up is unpleasant. Okay? Here we go. Okay? Okay, none of that is the implicit association test. That's all warm-up. Here's where we get to the implicit associations. What I would do is I'd show you this. And I would then start alternating names with things like onsen and paper cuts. And then we would have another round where I would do the same thing, only this way. And if you were slower, because this is all timed, if you were slower in choosing a side when unpleasant was on the same side as Japanese and pleasant was on the same side as American, that would demonstrate to researchers you have an implicit bias against the concept of being American, because you have a pathway in your brain for associating pleasant with Japanese. You have less of a pathway in your brain for associating pleasant with American and unpleasant with Japanese. Professor Mahzarin at Harvard still has the test up. You can go and you can play with the various implicit association tests. You will find there are a bunch of them. That's not even all of them. That's roughly half. And if you were to check out a couple, I think you would get a pretty good understanding of what we talk about when we talk about implicit bias. You could also read some of what they've written up about the results of those studies. But that's just a starter on the concept. Now let me give you some of the findings in recent years that give you an idea of how interaction occurs, interracial reaction, primarily in North America, in the United States. 2019 study. This one I'm cheating a little bit. It was in Canada. Justin Friesen at the University of Winnipeg. Here's what he asked people to do. He just showed them pictures of people smiling. And the task was, is this a Duchenne smile or a non-Duchenne smile? We talked about those a few weeks ago. Duchenne smile has the wrinkles around the corners of the eyes. But here was the twist to the study. Some of the faces were of black people, Duchenne, non-Duchenne. Some were of white people, Duchenne, non-Duchenne. The participants were only either black people or white people. If they identified as any other race, they were not invited to participate. Black participants were very accurate across all conditions. White participants were very accurate at identifying Duchenne smiles on the white faces, and terrible at it on the black faces. Very low accuracy. Now, the device they took the stimulus on when they participated in the study, it timed how long they stayed on each picture. And the white participants stayed on the black faces for much less time than they did on the white faces. They would come to them quickly, make a quick judgment, and go on and be very inaccurate. And Friesen and associates, based on a hunch, they ran a second study. And in the second study, they put in the instructions, please be sure to look at the eyes in the picture before you make your judgment. And they then did a distraction test to make sure that participants had read that instruction. And all of a sudden, the white participants were accurate. And from that, they concluded that the white participants, the population, the sample they'd taken it from, they were less accurate because they would not look the black faces in the eye. Second study. Philip Goff, UCLA, 2014. He began from the observation in the United States, when a child commits a crime, someone under 18 commits a crime, typically what happens is children are referred to the juvenile justice system. And they are sent for counseling, they're sent for psychological help, but they don't go to prison. But sometimes when there's a really, really violent and upsetting crime, the attorneys, the district attorney, the prosecutor will make a decision to try the child as an adult. Now that does not end well, usually. Children who are tried as adults and sentenced to adult prison, this is the part where it's going to get depressing, they're twice as likely to be assaulted by a jailer. They're 5 times as likely to be sexually assaulted, and they're 8 times as likely to commit suicide. With that in mind, black children are 18 times as likely as white children to be charged and sentenced as adults. Black children are 13% of the population. They're almost 60% of the population of children who are in adult prisons. So he started from those observations. This is the study that he set up, or what he thought part of what was happening was people were looking at black children and seeing something different from when they looked at white children. So this was the setup. He showed his participants pictures of children in different age brackets. They were asked, how innocent is this child? How able is this child to care for themselves? How much in need of protection is this child? And most importantly, how old do you think they are? Now, when what they showed was very, very young children, the race didn't matter. If you showed kindergartners, then participants in the study of any race, or actually I think I have that detail wrong. The participants, actually they participated white people to review these photos. But at this age, no difference. But you go up to the age brackets were 10 to 13, 14 to 17, and 18 to 21. When you got to about 10 years old, the participants in the study started estimating that the black children were in the next higher bracket up. And in response to those other questions, how innocent are they? Those measures went down. How able to take care of themselves? That went up. How much in need of protection? That went down. So here we have some 11-year-olds that the participants in the study would have recognized as 11-year-olds. And here we have some 11-year-olds that participants in the study would have said were about 14 years old. And that pattern was very consistent. A follow-on study that he did, he told participants in the study, gave them about a 1-paragraph story, gave a girl's name, said the girl had been caught shoplifting, and asked the question, showed a picture, and said, how old do you think she is? Do you think she just made a stupid mistake like young people do? Or do you think that this is a criminal who needs to go to face the consequences of her actions and needs to be locked up so other people are safe? And half the people were shown this 14-year-old, and half were shown this 14-year-old, and you can probably tell by now what the results were. They accurately guessed their estimates clustered around 14 years old. And she made a stupid mistake. She doesn't need to have her life ruined. She probably just needs counseling. She's 19 and needs to be sent to adult court and needs to be locked up in adult prison because she'll steal anything that isn't nailed down and people need to be kept safe from her. A few years later, a researcher named Paul Hutchings at Cardiff University did a study in which he recruited, oh, wait a minute. That's not right, not Paul Hutchings. This is Amy Halberstadt. Amy Halberstadt. She's an American researcher. She recruited college students, white college students, who were majoring in education. So they were training to become school teachers. And what she did is she showed them pictures of children and asked them, these were actually the pictures she showed in the study, asked them what emotion is being shown. Now there are 3 pictures here because based on the method, she would show the pictures in multiple rounds and the emotion would get clearer and clearer in each round. And here, by the way, were the girls. She also had the education majors, before they reviewed the photos, she had them take a test of racial attitudes. What's your attitude toward people of other races? She also had them complete the implicit association test. So she had a measure both of what they explicitly knew, how they felt about other races, and of their implicit racial bias. What she found was everybody, no matter their attitude, no matter their implicit bias, they all exaggerated, they all had a bias, a distortion, that the black children looked angry. Now, implicit bias, if they had implicit attitudes about black children, that did not change overestimating anger in the black faces. The education majors with low implicit bias also saw anger where there was no anger. But the education majors with high implicit bias were less likely to think the white children were angry. There was a general effect of seeing a little more anger in the faces than the children were showing, but it was far milder with the white children, with the participants who had high implicit bias. So we've talked before about decoding skills, about how you look at people's emotions and you decode, and you can decode more accurately, you can decode less accurately. And what this line of research shows is people's decoding skills get thrown off by racial difference. They get thrown off by implicit associations. Our best explanation for where implicit bias comes from, it's not that you're a bad person. It's not that you secretly want to join a white supremacist group. It's not that at all. It's that people are bombarded with messages from TV shows, from movies, from advertisements, and they build up over time. Some of the original research that demonstrated implicit bias, and really the more recent research too, it's not something only white people have. A lot of black people have it. One of the studies that got Bodgerine and Greenwald interested in implicit bias, this happened, I want to say, back in the 1940s. 2 dolls, identical, but one of them was painted so that it had skin the tone of a black person. And children were asked, which doll do you want to play with? And they chose the white one, always. And they would tell the researcher, white is good, black is bad. Now, they weren't born thinking black people are bad, but they got a lot of messages from fairy tales, from movies. The bad guys always wear black. The good guys always wear white. So they had that association, and black children had it too and would ask for the white doll. So, this is a matter of perceptual distortion. Bringing us then to one for which I don't have a visual. I'm just going to tell you about it. This one had to do with speech patterns, and we've talked in here about vocalics before, that things you do while speaking send messages. This study was done by Jeffrey Grogger at the University of Chicago. The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth is conducted from time to time. It consists of, you do interviews with a lot of young people, children, teenagers, young adults, but you do them repeatedly. That's why it's longitudinal. So if you were recruited to participate, they might interview you when you're 10, and then again 13, and then 16, and then 21. There were all these recordings. So Grogger and his associates, they took those recordings, and those recordings do not have people's names on them, so they don't know who they were. That's to protect their privacy. But they do have a lot of other information for each person who was interviewed. They know what race. When they're a little older, when they're adults, they know how much education. They know what profession they work in and how much money they make. So Grogger and his research team, they broke down the recordings until they could find one complete sentence from as many of the black participants as possible. They then took that one sentence and they recruited a lot of people and asked, what race is this person? And often, the people who listened didn't agree and gave lots of answers. But there were a few where absolutely everybody, on hearing one sentence, said, that person is black. And there were some where everybody, on hearing one sentence, said, that person is white. They took both of those and set them aside. They said, distinctly black speech pattern, distinctly white speech pattern. Then what they did is they went back to all the information that had been collected on those interviewees. And they found that if you had a distinctly black speech pattern, your pay was 12% lower than the person with the distinctly white speech pattern, even correcting for education, correcting for what job you did, number of years you've been in the workforce, and remember, both groups are black. So just the speech pattern. It didn't account for 1 or 2% difference in pay. 12% is an eighth. It's big. So the way people are responding to speech patterns that associate with race and speech patterns that people, they heard it and they said, that sounds black, that predicted much lower pay. All right. 2 more of these, and then, actually 3, and then we will start to talk some applications of this. For this next one, I want you to go back to thinking about nonverbal immediacy for a moment. Nonverbal cues that show psychological closeness. In my first example, whenever I introduce nonverbal immediacy, is a trick I was taught early. When someone asks a question, walk toward them, because being physically close to them shows psychological closeness. With that in mind, this experiment, I have to say, I found wonderfully evil. This was done by, I think it was the same guy. Oh no, not Jeffrey Grogger. I don't have their affiliation. The names of the researchers were Goff, Steele, and Davies. Here's what they did. They invited in all white college students. To participate in the study, you had to be a white college student. And when you came in, a graduate student would meet you and say, okay, what you're going to do today is have a conversation. They would pick up a bag and shake it, and it had strips of paper. They would say, please draw a strip of paper, and that'll tell you what the conversation's going to be about. There were only 2 actual topics in that bag, just lots of copies of them. One of them was, you're going to talk about love and relationships. And the other strip said, you're going to talk about racism. So they pull it out, they find out what the topic was, and then the graduate student would say, oh, by the way, for our study, I need to take a picture of you. So they'd pick up a Polaroid instant camera that would spit out a physical picture, and they would snap a picture, and then they would take that picture, go over to a bulletin board, and put the picture up next to 2 other pictures. And in the control condition, the 2 other pictures were white people. So the student was there, or the participant, the college student, was led to believe they were going to have a talk about love and relationships or about racism with 2 white people. But in the experimental condition, they'd walk over to the bulletin board with a picture, and the other 2 pictures were black people. So then, The graduate student would lead the participant down the hall to the room, and there would be 3 chairs, 3 folding chairs, but they'd be folded in against the wall. And this poor graduate student had to do this over and over again. They'd say, they didn't set up the room again. I asked them, they didn't set up the room. They would turn to the participant and say, would you set up the chairs, please? Just put the chairs in a position where you'll be comfortable having a conversation, and the graduate student would then leave. And then the participant in the study would set the chairs up. And that was the study. They wanted to measure how far apart were the chairs. As soon as the participant had set the chairs up, the grad student came back down the hall and said, thank you very much, that was actually the study, and debriefed them about what it was about. And what it found was, when the student thought they were going to have a discussion of race with 2 black people, the chairs were much further apart. Much further apart. Interestingly, there were a couple of other findings. One of them was, if they drew from the bag love and relationships, and then they saw black faces on the bulletin board, they put the chairs closer together than if the faces were white. They really wanted to have that talk, and they were interested in having it with people who were black, apparently. The other thing is, the team did a second study. This is almost even more evil. If the topic they drew was race, the graduate student would then hand them a piece of paper and say, this is what we're going to use to get the conversation started. And this poor participant in the study would read a statement that said, well, naturally the police arrest more black people. Black people are violent. They commit lots of crimes. They're dangerous. I don't want to be around black people. But the grad student would then tell the participant, okay, we're going to tell them, and all 3 of you will know that you don't believe this, but just that these attitudes are out there and that that's what you're going to discuss. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to see, with the prospect of having to say that to 2 people they thought were black, would that make the distance even further? And the answer was it didn't. When they knew they were going to say something that upsetting, but the other people in the conversation would know they didn't really believe it, then they didn't have to sit further away. And the researchers concluded what really is happening is identity threat. If your identity is secure, if the other participants in the conversation know that it is not what you believe, that these attitudes are just out there, that's not the kind of thing that creates psychological distance. But when you have to say what you believe, and you think the other participants in the discussion might interpret it as you have racist attitudes, that's the kind of thing that made them set the chairs further apart. All right. Second to last one. Done by Nicole Richardson in 2005. The first thing that they had to do was create the stimulus materials. So some white college students were brought in to have a conversation with an interviewer on topics having to do with race. And sometimes the interviewer was black, and sometimes the interviewer was white. And in setting up the study, the researchers had the white college student take the measure of implicit bias. So they knew this student who'd come in to be interviewed had high or low implicit bias. Then they would edit the video so you couldn't see who they were talking to. Then the participants in the study were either white or black. And they were asked 2 questions. Who are they talking to? What race? And how comfortable are they? White participants asked those 2 questions were not at all accurate. Black participants were not accurate either when the person you couldn't see was white or when this student had low implicit bias. But when this student had high implicit bias and the person you couldn't see was black, the black participants in the study could tell. They would just watch the white student not see the conversation partner, but they would say they're talking to someone black and they're not comfortable. That is the setup for the very last study. And I remember first hearing about implicit bias years ago, and I want to say that I've actually shared this with you, that I gave you this very quickly at a previous class meeting, but maybe not. I talked to a lot of people about this. If this is your second time hearing it, we'll call it review. I first heard about implicit bias and I thought, okay, that's a fascinating little trick. People take longer to make the connection between their race and unpleasant and the other race and pleasant, but that doesn't prove anything. Does that mean that people have attitudes or that they behave? And I read the research and no, it doesn't prove that at all. One thing that does show up pretty consistently, if a lot of people in a particular neighborhood have high implicit bias, there are more bias crimes in the neighborhood. But does that mean individuals have different attitudes based on how quickly they respond when they take that test? And the answer was no. But then, a researcher at Yale University named Jack Dovidio, here's what he did. He recruited a lot of medical doctors, and he had them take the implicit association test so he knew their level of implicit bias. He also had them complete a survey of their attitudes toward people of other races. And some doctors come from small towns that are very racially alike, and they admit, I feel uncomfortable around people of other races. I don't know what to say. With those two measures of data, their explicit attitudes, their implicit attitudes, Dovidio then made videotapes, video recordings of a lot of appointments between white doctors and black patients. And here's what he found. Their explicit attitudes were what predicted the words that they used. So if they had positive attitudes toward people of other races, they would compliment them, they would be affectionate, they would use humor. In every way, they'd be welcoming. But if they had high implicit bias, what the video showed, they stood further away, turned their back more often, didn't make eye contact as often, stood over the patient more often. You remember all those immediacy cues that we named? They showed non-immediacy every possible way. That finally made sense of it to me because there are decades and decades of studies and other kinds of data collection where black patients have gone to white doctors and they've said, I can tell that doctor doesn't care about me. And a lot of doctors who hear that say, what are you talking about? I love all my patients. I went into medicine because I want to ease suffering. I feel the same about all my patients. They're both right. Because the doctor is making a choice to use language in ways that are welcoming because we have more choice, we have more control over the words we use. But the doctor is not nearly as able to control their nonverbal signs of immediacy. And their implicit bias is showing up in the immediacy cues. If you have ever met someone for the first time and in every way they're saying the right thing, they're being friendly, but you can just tell they don't like you, that is how implicit bias shows up in non-immediacy across racial groupings. And the person who's sending the non-immediacy message may not even be aware that they're doing it. All right. Bringing us then to the final topic that we will take up today. And actually, what I should do, I should time out here for a second. I often don't think about doing this until too late. And I should ask, based on anything we've said so far, do you have questions? Do you want to hear more about the methods of these studies? Do you want to hear more about the conclusions that the researchers reached? I do have one topic to put at the end of this, but that can wait. Yes?
I understood that there's a negative bias
Right.
of black people, but
Mm-hmm.
what would the results be like if Asians instead of
Right. So the question, what would the results be if we talk about a different racial barrier, not white and black, but a different, Asians or another group? Did I get the question right? Okay. Dovideo, to my knowledge, has not run that study, but if you looked at the list of implicit association tests, there are implicit association tests for Asians, for Arabs, and there have been studies done of the association between implicit bias and non-immediacy cues for other racial groupings too. So I do know relations between white people and black people in the United States. There are a lot of people who build a career out of researching this, and they say it's not even fair to call racial attitudes between white people and black people. It's not even accurate or helpful to call them racism. And they've started calling them anti-black because they've said there are misunderstandings and distortions between white people and Asian people and, Pacific Island people. All those differences, barriers of difference exist. But between white and black in the United States, given their history, it's more intense. In many ways, that's where the research began, because of the country's history, and because it's so intense, the effects show up more sharply. So there's good reason to believe similar effects exist wherever there's that kind of barrier of racial misunderstanding, but it's not as pronounced. Do you have a follow-up? Or?
So if the research was done with Asian people and white people, would the results be Asian people are less innocent? Or
So the implicit association, okay, the question was, if the research was done with white people and Asian people, would it be that Asian people are less innocent? The implicit associations are very, very different depending on the racial group. A lot of the difficult racial misunderstandings in the United States between white people and Asian people, the phrase that's often used to describe them is the model minority. One common experience reported by students in the United States in high school or in college, a student who is Asian or Asian American, just looks Asian but maybe lived all their life in the United States, they will be struggling in a math class or a science class, and nobody believes them. They can't get tutoring help or anything else because the people around them, teachers and everybody else, say, you have to be good at math, you're Asian. That's an association that people in the United States have, a lot of people, not all, but a lot, have with that racial grouping. And they get that, again, TV shows, movies, it's a bunch of little, almost raindrops of exposure to the idea, and they build up. And the cultural products in the United States show that black people are violent and dangerous, and Asians are really good at math. And at some point, you just have a layer of assumption, especially if you are like a lot of people in the United States and live in a very racially uniform neighborhood where you haven't met people of other races. So I'm taking a long time to get to the answer to your question. There were, during the worst days of the pandemic, there were some associations. There were people acting out and even committing violent hate crimes in the United States against Asian people because the coronavirus was the Asian flu. But that's new. That's very new. And it got a lot of attention because it was almost unprecedented for the instant automatic reaction. And that wasn't even automatic. People were thinking that through and arriving at that opinion. But some of these other associations, seeing people of different races, it is unconscious and it is automatic. So I feel like I talked round and round and round your question. Did I get to it? Okay. You're welcome. Does anyone else have questions? All right. Let us get to one more topic if we are going to understand nonverbals and interaction between racial groups. We are not going to have the entire long discussion of microaggressions. We are going to talk about nonverbal microaggressions. And because I saw a couple of people look annoyed, when I put that word up on the screen. I will also point out there's some controversy around this, and we will acknowledge that. All right. A microaggression. The term was coined 50 years ago. Research into it sped up in the early 2000s. It's been spearheaded by a professor at Columbia University named Daryl Wing Su. We tend to think when we think of negative communication, not ideal communication between racially different people, we tend to think of it as hostility. I don't like other racial groups. I think they're inferior. I don't trust them. But microaggressions tend not to be hostile. They tend to just be clumsy. Often, they are things that are conveyed with good intentions. Someone intends to say something nice. But what microaggressions have in common, they tend to imply that you don't belong. I have a colleague over at Tsudo University who is from a Korean family. Her parents run a Korean barbecue. She has a Korean name. If you were to see, I think you can tell just from looking at her, she kind of has a Korean look. She was born here, lived here all her life. And people say to her, wow, your Japanese is so good. And she says, yeah, so is yours. Of course her Japanese is good. She's a native speaker. But they notice all those other details, and they're not saying, go back to Korea, you dirty Korean. A microaggression, it crossed my mind. You can find this one without looking very far. There are a lot of dark-skinned women in the world who have heard someone compliment them, wow, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Well, that last part kind of ruined the compliment. I mean, either they're pretty or they're not. So, the idea that what a microaggression does is imply that you don't belong, that they belong and you don't. The other thing about them is, commonly they are so subtle that you may question whether they really happened. But people who experience this often experience a whole lot of them. They happen a lot, over and over and over again. I can give you an experience I've had since I arrived in Japan that gave me a new insight into them. So, you may have something that you keep with you all the time. Maybe it's your tablet, maybe it's your phone. Maybe this is something I keep with me all the time, and I know I can always reach for it and it's right there. And at some point, I reach over and I look down and I frown. And it's a frown of confusion. It's not a frown of hostility. It's not a frown of anger or hate or anything. I spent my first 2 or 3 weeks after arriving in Japan wondering, why do I feel so bad? Why do I feel like everyone's mad at me all the time? Like I'm, doing everything wrong and nobody will tell me. And I realized after I'd been here a few weeks that a dozen times a day when I was out in public, someone would come swinging around a corner or someone would come onto a train or something and they'd look right at me and they'd frown. And I was getting frowned at over and over again all day. And I started to watch it, and I realized it's not a hostile frown. They don't hate me. They're frowning the same way I would frown if something wasn't where I expected it to be. Their frown is saying to me, now what are you doing here? You look like you just kind of don't fit. And if 1 or 2 people did it to me in a day, it wouldn't have any effect on me. But you have 50 people do that to you in a day. You get frowned at by 50 people where you come from, nobody frowns at you. It takes a while to notice what's happening. That, I realized, is a rough approximation of what it's like to be on the receiving end of these little tiny cues that tell you you don't really belong. So, why am I bringing this up in a nonverbal communication class? Because part of the definition of microaggressions is they can be verbal or nonverbal. Verbal or nonverbal. The classic example of a nonverbal microaggression. This happens to a whole lot, in the United States, a whole lot of black people. They will be out somewhere in a public place. They will see a woman who is carrying a purse. The woman will make direct eye contact with them and pull the purse closer. And they wonder, did that woman just show me that she was afraid I was going to steal her purse? And if it happens one time, you don't notice it. But if you walk around all day and you see 50 people do it, at some point it's not your imagination. Another example of this, black people in the United States go to shop in a store and they'll notice a store employee follows them around just to make sure that they're not taking anything. And they can take their white friends along with them, and the white friend can go browse around the store. Nobody follows them. Not openly hostile. And they even question, is this really happening? But that's a classic example of a nonverbal microaggression. Now, the slightly less classic examples, and the ones that may not be necessarily white-black, but every immediacy cue that we mentioned, all of them withholding those cues in a striking fashion, can be a way of showing someone they don't belong. So let's imagine you are hired and show up for your first day of work at a company. They like you, you're accepted, you work there 2 or 3 years, and then they hire someone new, let's say, who's transgender and recently transitioned. And a lot of people in that workplace feel uncomfortable. You know how you might be able to tell? They'll put on their best behavior because they don't want any trouble with human relations. But they make less eye contact. They don't smile as often. They stand a little further away. When one person does it on one meeting, it's no big deal. Might be your imagination. When everybody does it and they do it consistently, they're showing you, and they're showing you non-verbally, that you don't belong. So, why do I bring this up? I bring this up for 2 reasons. First of all, the case that diverse workplaces, racially diverse and diverse in other ways, make more money and work better, that case is getting stronger by the year. The research is mounting up. The problem is a lot of companies and a lot of other organizations, schools, government agencies, they try to recruit people who are different because it will make their business run better, and they can't retain them. They'll work there for a few months or a year and then move on. Colleges have a terrible time trying to recruit faculty, not just recruit, but retain faculty members from underrepresented groups, because they stay for a little while and then they leave. They leave because they've been shown they don't belong. And very commonly, the way they're shown they don't belong is very subtle. They're left out in ways that may be as simple as they notice everybody gets together to laugh about the latest thing that happened, and they're not included. And a big way they form that impression comes through this exact problem. That's implication number 1. Here comes implication number 2, and then I will take questions for the second time. A researcher at the University of Michigan School of Public Health got interested in a really simple question. For most racial groups in the United States, for women, if you get pregnant while you're a teenager, that's not good. Your baby will probably not be healthy, and the pregnancy will take its toll on your own body. The older you get into your 30s, 20s and 30s, your pregnancy outcomes get better because your body fully matures and it's ready. The exception is black women. Black women in the United States have the best outcomes to pregnancy in their teens. In their 20s and 30s, the pregnancies get worse. And it's not caused by poverty. Wealthy black women are more likely to miscarry and more likely to have threatening health conditions, preeclampsia, things like that, in their 20s and 30s. College-educated black women with PhDs, same problem. The model that Geronimus has been pursuing, and there are other researchers who also find results that support this, is what she calls weathering. Weathering. Now, to give you a visual of what she means, there's a building with some siding on it that's brand new, and a year later, after exposure to sun and rain and wind and freezing cold and hailstorms, it gets weathered and you can see the damage. Geronimus borrowed the word weathering because she said, there are stressors going on in the lives of black women that are they're the model, the explanation that fits the data. There's no other reason that black women of every level of socioeconomic status should have bad pregnancy outcomes as they get older. That's not true for any other racial group. And there are a lot of other chronic health conditions that where one of the elements is stress. Heart disease, Alzheimer's, respiratory illnesses like asthma, all worse in black populations. Because the longer they live, the more the daily stressors accumulate and leave a mark on their health. And so a number of people have taken the microaggression research and they've said, it may be the biggest, or one of the bigger problems we have with race today is not open hostility. It's not white supremacist groups. They're a problem. But the real problem is the small stressors that it's easy to overlook and hard to solve. So the idea that withholding immediacy cues from people because they are different, that's contributing to a daily stress load. That is one of the roots to this particular phenomenon, racial weathering, and some of the health outcomes and some of the difficulties in retaining talent in the organizations you may find yourself in after you graduate college. That's the implication of microaggressions and why I included it on this discussion. Okay, we defined race, distinguished it from ethnicity. We did a quick run-through of implicit associations. We talked through some of the recent studies that show the distortions in how we view people of different races and in how discomfort can be conveyed even when you don't think you're conveying it or you don't even think you're experiencing it. And then a moment or two on microaggressions because, I said I was going to acknowledge the controversy and then I didn't do it. Let me do this just really quickly. The response to the phenomenon of microaggressions, and the phenomenon of microaggressions is very well documented. What's not as well documented is there are a lot of organizations that have adopted anti-microaggression training. And we are reaching a tipping point that just does not do any dang good, that it actually makes things worse. That when people feel that they're being condemned for something they didn't even know they were doing, that's more likely to motivate people to act out, to backlash, to assert themselves with even more hostility than if they'd never been training in the first place. So the only thing I want to say is, teen pregnancy is a problem in the United States. That doesn't mean that all sex education programs are a good idea, because a bad sex education program can make things worse. Microaggressions are real and have a real effect. That doesn't mean that organizations trying to respond to microaggressions will always do a good job, because very often they don't do a good job. And the fact that they have good intentions because they see a problem doesn't mean that they necessarily have the solution. That's the part that is controversial. And I also brought it up just because there is a certain amount of initiative beginning in Japan to try to respond to microaggressions that happen in a lot of public settings, in workplaces, in schools, even in healthcare. So I think this is probably not the last time you're going to hear about this. Now this time I really am done with what I want to say on the subject, so I'm going to see, do you have questions you want to ask about any of that? Then what I will do, I will remind you very quickly, tonight is the deadline for you to post the video of the question you're asking to your classmates from the article report. A week from today, what we're going to do next week is largely what we did today, only with gender. And that one, it's not a cheerful subject, but it's probably not as grumpy as the race subject and the deceit subject. So if you're thinking it's too much of a downer, I don't even want to come next week, it may not be actually that dark. At any rate, The thing that's due Thursday of next week is the people watching report. So if you have not gotten together with your classmate and gone out and watched for nonverbal cues that the two of you interpret differently, time's running out. You have 1 week left. Do you have anything you need to ask me about the question video or about the people watching report? Okay. You want to go be the first in line for lunch? You should go be the first in line for lunch. Class is dismissed. I will see you in a week.